If you stick to these 12 rules, you will get jacked, or you'll at least increase your likelihood of getting jacked. And if you don't, you still might get jacked, but it might take longer, and that is just way less fun. And these rules are no particular order here, so each one is of importance. So number one, train with an appropriate training volume. This is one of the most important rules, as volume seems to be one of the biggest contributors to muscle hypertrophy. So an appropriate training volume. So what this means is training with enough volume to stimulate hypertrophy, so an effective amount of volume, but not so much volume in which you can't recover from that training. So you don't want to see a bunch of overlapping soreness. You don't want to just feel so beat up all the time that your performance is going down, but you also want to make sure that when you're training, like, you're getting some following day muscle fatigue, you're feeling maybe a little bit of soreness here and there, and you're doing an effective amount of training. And you are seeing your strength numbers, meso over meso, increase over time, and your training overall still feels challenging. All right. So number one, training with enough volume. Number two, training with an appropriate frequency. So when I say frequency, I mean how many times you train a muscle per week. And it seems as though for optimal hypertrophy, you probably want to be training a muscle at least 2 times per week. There's some research suggesting that even going upwards of 3+ times per week might be beneficial. And one of the biggest mechanistic reasons for this is because after you train, you elevate muscle protein synthesis, which is literally the synthesizing or the growing of new muscle tissue. But that's only elevated for probably around about 24 to 48 hours. So if you only train once per week, there's a decent chance that that's only going to be elevated for a few days per week. But if you train a couple times a week or even 3 times a week, then it's likely you have those elevations in protein synthesis for a longer time throughout the week, leading to more muscle growth. Now, that doesn't mean that people can't grow muscle with just one stimulus per week, but for most people, training at least twice per week is probably a good idea. And I like the range of about 2 to 4 times if it's potentially a muscle that doesn't experience a lot of muscle damage often and tends to recover more quickly. So these would be muscles like maybe your biceps or your delts or your abs, calves, different things like that. Maybe sticking towards the upper end of that range is a good idea. And then if it's a muscle that tends to experience a bit more muscle damage and gets a little bit more sore, maybe towards the bottom of that end is a better idea. So that would be things like, for me anyways, my hamstrings, my quads, my chest, and different muscles like that. Number 3, train with an appropriate relative intensity. So when I mean relative intensity, this means how many reps in reserve you are leaving per set. And generally, I think it's best to leave about 2 reps in reserve on average per set across your mesocycle. So this means that maybe you start your mesocycle around 3 or 4 reps in reserve. So you finish a set and you think you can still do another 3 or 4 reps. And then you end a mesocycle pretty much training to failure. And this kind of gives you an average of about 2 reps in reserve. And I think that's probably about right, because you still get a very effective stimulus per set, but you don't get nearly as much fatigue as training to all-out failure all the time. And it seems as though for hypertrophy, you don't need to train to failure to maximize muscle growth. And if that is true, then you can probably save yourself a lot of fatigue, especially systemic fatigue, from training to all-out failure by just leaving a couple reps in the tank. Now, your sets still should be very challenging. They should be hard. You should not finish a set and be like, that was a cakewalk. If that's true, you probably didn't have 2 reps in reserve. But generally, I would recommend starting a mesocycle around 3 or 4 reps in reserve, ending one around 0 to 1 reps in reserve. Number 4, train with an appropriate rep range. On average, I think it's best for hypertrophy to train in the 8 to 15 rep range, but that's on average. You can definitely go below this range and you can definitely go above it. But I think that, if you did all of your training exclusively in that 20+ rep range, there's potential issues with that in which you run into limitations that aren't actual muscle fatigue. So cardiovascular fatigue, maybe you run into just being a bit unstable. It's usually a little harder to train to failure when you're up in those higher rep ranges. And then vice versa on the bottom end. Yes, you can grow muscle training in that like 3 to 8 rep range, but it generally comes with a lot more fatigue with it. And I think that in all of your training and in developing a quality program, if you're able to maximize the stimulus you get compared to the amount of fatigue you get, you can just do more recoverable training, which probably leads to more progress. And I think the 8 to 15 rep range on average leads to the best stimulus to fatigue ratio. So that's where I would stay. Number 5, train with good technique and don't overlook mind muscle connection. So when you're training, when I was early on in my training, there were several lifts that I just cared about getting stronger and moving more weight in. And what this led to was me doing like, not even parallel squats, doing sumo deadlifts in which my range of motion was like 3 inches, doing bench press to where I would use a huge arch and a huge wide grip just to limit my range of motion to move more weight. And I wasn't thinking about technique for the best kind of stimulus to fatigue ratio for muscle growth. And I wasn't at all concerned about mind muscle connection or feeling tension on my target muscle. And I think that this just led to a poor stimulus to fatigue ratio in which, I could move a lot of weight and it was systemically fatiguing, but it actually wasn't yielding the muscle growth I was looking for. And I think that if you're able to train with very quality technique, that doesn't mean you can't use a little bit of momentum here and there. I know if you've seen my bicep curl videos, I like to use a little bit of momentum on those, but generally using good technique with a controlled movement, and you also feel the tension of the weight on your target muscle on most lifts, on like something like a squat or a deadlift or a lunge. I'm okay if you don't feel as much of a mind muscle connection, but you should still be using quality technique. All right. So train with good technique and don't overlook feeling the tension on that muscle, as I think this is also going to maximize that stimulus to fatigue ratio. Number 6, gradually increase the training stimulus over time. And I think that one of the best ways to do this is by increasing your strength over time for reps, for a handful of movements, and kind of tracking those over time. Now, it's important to know that you don't need to get stronger each workout. And what this kind of rule alludes to is progressive overload. You want to, as you adapt and you grow muscle, you want to progressively increase your training stress, because now that you are more adapted, the training stress to elicit an adaptation is higher. So you should increase your training stress as you continue to make these adaptations. But how long does it take to grow muscle? Quite a long time. And how much muscle do you grow in one single week? Very little. So does it make sense to have to increase your training stress every single week just to apply this principle of progressive overload? No, I don't think it does. And I think it makes much more sense to apply this principle over a longer time course, a time course in which you can actually see some appreciable muscle growth. So I would say to apply this principle or this rule, increasing your strength every few mesocycles on a core handful of lifts is probably sufficient here. All right. So number 6, gradually increase the training stimulus over time, but it should be on the time course of adaptation, not just every single week. Number 7, train with specificity. There's so many people that I've looked at clients' old programs, and they'll have a lot of stuff in there like, stretching for 20 minutes before they start and foam rolling. And then they do like this weird shoulder exercise because they think it does some sort of prehab stuff. And they're just doing a lot of stuff in their program that isn't actually specific to their goals. Now, am I saying that you should never stretch or do foam rolling or any sort of prehab stuff? No, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying if you're like generally healthy and not noticing any issues with your range of motion or with doing your just regular hypertrophy training, then I think most of that stuff's a waste of time. And I think that you should really ask yourself, is everything you're doing in the gym aligned with your long-term goals? And for me, this really came back to, I was the type of person that really liked to try to do like heavy singles and kind of see where I'm at strength-wise. And does doing a heavy single on a handful of lifts really help me with my hypertrophy goals? Probably not. And That's a little bit different than like potentiation sets of purposefully doing that. But doing a heavy single close to failure and almost maxing out just brings a bunch of fatigue, and it's probably not going to lead to much hypertrophy. So it's almost directly counter to my goals. And I think it's really important to ask yourself, is everything you're doing in the gym aligned with your goals and what you want to get out of your training? And if it is, great. You are very specific in your training. But if there's a good amount of stuff that's not specific to your goal, then I would say you're probably wasting your time as well as recovery resources on stuff that's not going to help you progress, which might lead to you not progressing much at all or at a much slower rate. Number 8, eat an appropriate amount of calories. If you want to grow muscle, you most likely, for most people beyond the first several months of training, you very likely need to be eating at least maintenance calories or close to maintenance calories. Now, as you go and you get more advanced, I think it probably becomes more and more important to eat in a calorie surplus to grow muscle. And how much of a calorie surplus? Well, I like to shoot for about 1% body weight gained per month. So usually about a 200 to 300 calorie surplus per day will kind of lead to this. All right. And then you can track your weekly averages, see if you're gaining at your target rate, and adjust your calories from there. Now, on the flip side, if you want to lose weight, I recommend losing at a rate of about 0.5% to 1% of your body weight per week. So I would probably start in about a 500 calorie deficit per day compared to your maintenance calories, and then adjust that deficit based on how fast you're losing and kind of shoot for that target rate. All right. So number 8, eat an appropriate number of calories, which really just comes down to energy balance and making sure that you're gaining tissue at an appropriate rate for your current goals in that phase, whether it's gaining or cutting. Number 9, eat enough protein. I would say anywhere between about 0.8 grams to 1.2 or 1.5 grams per pound of body weight is reasonable. Generally, I like to recommend just eating about 1 gram per pound of body weight all the time because it's just simple and fairly easy to do for most people. Now, you could also base that off of lean body mass and probably be just fine as well. And 1 gram per pound is probably pretty dang conservative, but generally 1 gram per pound is simple and sufficient. Number 10, sleep enough. This still is one of my trickiest things. I know that going through college, I was always like, okay, if I want to be successful, I have to get up at 4 a.m. in the morning, but then I was just going to bed at like 8 p.m. at night. And it's like, why don't I just like work a couple hours later at night and then get up a little bit later and actually sleep? So this definitely was a bit of a problem for me. But then I started really dialing in my sleep hygiene. So sleeping in a cool and dark environment, having a little bit of white noise helps me out, doesn't help everybody out. Making sure to avoid caffeine. For me, I don't drink any caffeine after about 1 p.m. in the afternoon, or else I notice it influences my sleep. Also, limiting light exposure later in the day and getting some light exposure early in the day can help. And then generally getting into a consistent sleep schedule and having a consistent wind down routine before bed can help. I personally like to read about 30 minutes before bed, but I often fall asleep after 10 minutes. So that works very, very well for me. So number 10, sleep enough. For most people, 7 to 9 hours per night is about right. Number 11, be consistent with your training, nutrition, and all that stuff. Without consistency, none of these rules really matter. Yes, you can know all the stuff, but if you don't actually do it, it's not going to help you. So number 11, make sure that you're consistent with all this stuff and just keep showing up. Sometimes progress can be like watching paint dry, but you will get there. Be consistent and just keep showing up. Number 12, stick to a certain program for at least a few months before switching things up. Often people will change their program on a weekly basis and they just are switching things up too much to really know if they're making progress and to really adjust things based on how you're responding. And I think one of the most important things to do is adjusting how you're responding to make sure that you're training with an appropriate training volume and to make sure that you can gradually increase that training stimulus over time. If you're changing these around too much, you can't really do that. So I would make sure to stick to a program for at least a few months at a time. Now, if after that few months you really haven't made much progress, then I would really take a look at, okay, am I training with an appropriate training volume? Should I try to change up my training frequency? Am I training close enough to failure? Am I training too close to failure all the time? Am I training with appropriate rep ranges? Is everything I'm doing specific to my training? After those few months, really take a look at that stuff to see if you're making progress or not. And then you can make some adjustments there. Now, with these 12 rules, some people just have an overall really hard part with a number 8, eating an appropriate number of calories. And if that is you, I have a video for you.